When a millionaire invited his black maid son to play chess, everyone in the room thought it was just a cruel joke. An easy way to mock a child whose mother scrubbed their floors. But what they didn't know was that this boy wasn't ordinary. He wasn't shy, he wasn't intimidated. He was a hidden child genius, about to turn their laughter into silence and their arrogance into shame. The mansion itself was a symbol of wealth that stretched beyond imagination, towering columns, sprawling gardens, and a driveway that gleamed with polished cars most people would never touch in their lifetime. Inside, crystal chandeliers spilled golden light across marble floors, and every inch of the space seemed built to remind visitors that power lived here. Its master, Richard Hale, was a man used to being obeyed. His sharp suits and sharper tongue carved fear and admiration in equal measure. But beneath the shine and polish, Richard carried a casual cruelty. He had no real concern for the people who oiled the wheels of his comfortable life. The gardeners, the drivers, the cooks, the cleaners, they were invisible to him, mere shadows in his empire. Among them was Evelyn Carter, a black woman who had worked in his mansion for nearly 10 years. She was reliable, meticulous, and patient, a woman who carried dignity in every careful movement. Her hands were tired from years of work, but her back never bent, not even under Richard's cold indifference. Evelyn had a son, Marcus, just 12 years old, tall for his age, with eyes that held a quiet fire. Marcus wasn't like other children. While kids in his neighborhood lost themselves in video games or ran wild in the streets, Marcus lived in a different world. His world was shaped by black and white squares, carved pieces standing in formation, and strategies that unfolded like battles in his mind. Chess wasn't just a game to him, it was a language, one he had taught himself fluently, night after night while his mother worked late. Marcus studied books borrowed from the library, replayed grandmaster matches, and trained his mind until it was sharper than most men's. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Evelyn found herself with no choice but to bring Marcus along to the mansion. Her sitter had canceled, and leaving him alone wasn't an option. She hoped quietly that Richard wouldn't notice. Marcus kept to himself in the kitchen, reading a battered chess book, while Evelyn polished silver trays for a gathering Richard was hosting. But Richard did notice. He strolled into the kitchen, glass of whiskey in hand, his eyes landing on the boy. He tilted his head slightly, a smirk forming at the corner of his lips. "Your boy?" he asked casually, as though the child was a misplaced item. "Yes, sir," Evelyn replied carefully. "Marcus, he won't cause any trouble." Richard chuckled under his breath, already sensing an opportunity. The sound of laughter drifted from the drawing room, where his wealthy colleagues were drinking and trading stories of conquests, business, politics, and sport. In the corner of that room stood a gleaming mahogany chess table, the pieces carved from ivory and ebony, arranged neatly as if waiting for a challenger. Richard fancied himself a skilled player, though his knowledge barely scratched the surface. Still, he used the game as a way to impress guests, a stage for his ego. And now, with the maid's boy standing nearby, he saw a new kind of entertainment. "Bring him in," Richard ordered, his smirk widening. Evelyn's heart sank. She knew that tone. It wasn't an invitation, it was a performance. Moments later, Marcus found himself standing at the edge of the drawing room, the center of amused attention. The men glanced at him and snickered, leaning back in their chairs with drinks in hand. "What's this?" one of them jeered. "Richard, you planning to give us a comedy show?" Another laughed, raising his glass. "Careful, Hale, you don't want to be the man who lost to a child." The remark drew more laughter, bouncing off the walls like cruel echoes. Richard silenced them with a dismissive wave and gestured toward the board. "Sit down, boy. Let's see if you know how the pieces move." Evelyn wanted to protest, to shield her son from the ridicule she knew was coming. But Marcus, calm and composed, stepped forward. He pulled out the chair, sat down, and placed his small hands on the edge of the table. His face betrayed no fear, no hesitation, only focus. The game began with Richard pushing forward his pawn with a flourish, as though making a grand opening statement. Marcus countered quietly, his move simple but deliberate. The men chuckled again, sipping their drinks, not yet realizing what was unfolding. But within minutes, the tone of the room shifted. Marcus moved with precision, his eyes scanning the board with frightening speed. Each piece he touched seemed guided by an invisible strategy, a rhythm only he could hear. Richard, at first relaxed, began to frown. His counters grew slower, his moves less confident. Beginner's luck, he muttered after Marcus snatched his knight. But Marcus said nothing. His eyes never left the board. The laughter in the room faded into silence. The men leaned closer now, their amusement replaced with curiosity, then disbelief. Richard was sweating, shifting in his chair, as the boy across from him dismantled his defenses one move at a time. Evelyn stood frozen at the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always known her son was bright, but to see him here under these lights, outwitting a man who thought himself untouchable, it was almost too much to process. "Check," Marcus said softly, his voice steady. Richard's jaw tightened. He scrambled, searching for an escape. His hand hovered over his queen, then his rook, then pulled back, unable to find safety. Each move he made was met with another blow from the boy. The board was no longer his stage, it was his undoing. 5 minutes later, the final move came. Marcus lifted his queen and placed it gently on the board, his eyes meeting Richard's with quiet certainty. Checkmate. The word cut through the silence like a blade. For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. Richard sat frozen, his empire of arrogance reduced to a collection of fallen pieces. His colleagues exchanged stunned glances, their smirks erased. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, a swell of pride rushing through her chest. Her son, the boy they had intended to mock, had stripped the millionaire bare, not with wealth or power, but with brilliance. Richard forced a hollow laugh, trying to mask the sting. "Well," he said weakly, "looks like the boy got lucky." But the room knew better. They had seen it. The maid's son had outplayed the millionaire, and though Richard would pretend it was nothing, the truth had already sunk in. This wasn't luck. This was genius. What Richard and his friends thought was a joke had just revealed a power they couldn't control. And for Evelyn, standing at that doorway with tears in her eyes, it was the first glimpse of something she had always believed. Her son was destined for more than the world ever expected of him. The silence in the drawing room lingered long after Marcus uttered the final word, checkmate. The ivory queen stood defiantly on the board, a symbol of triumph that none of the men in that room had expected. For a brief second, the world felt flipped on its head, the millionaire humbled by the maid's son. One of Richard's colleagues coughed awkwardly, breaking the stillness. "Well," he muttered, swirling the ice in his glass, "looks like the young man's got a knack for the game." His voice carried no humor now, only unease. Another leaned forward, studying Marcus with a skeptical eye. "Where'd you learn to play like that, boy?" Marcus lifted his gaze, unflinching. "Books," he said simply. "From the library." The men exchanged uneasy glances. They had expected stuttering, fumbling, embarrassment. Instead, the boy's calm answer carried weight far beyond his years. Evelyn, standing at the doorway, bit back a proud smile. She wanted to protect him from their stares, but she also wanted them to see what she had always known. Marcus was extraordinary. Richard, however, refused to let the humiliation settle. He leaned back in his chair, forcing a laugh that echoed hollowly across the room. "Gentlemen, don't take it too seriously," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "It was just a game. Kids get lucky sometimes." But his words were thin and everyone knew it. Sweat still clung to his temples, his pride cracked wide open. For a man like Richard Hale, image was everything. Losing to a child, to a maid's child, was unthinkable. Evelyn sensed the danger in that silence. The way Richard's jaw tightened even as he tried to play it off. She knew his kind, the sort of men who could never stand being exposed, especially not in front of their peers. She quietly prayed the moment would pass without consequence. Marcus, oblivious to the tension, had already turned back to the board, resetting the pieces with methodical care. To him, the victory wasn't about humiliating Richard. It was about the joy of the game, the thrill of solving a puzzle. He didn't hear the whispered tones of the men or notice the flicker of anger in Richard's eyes. Later that evening, when the guests had gone and the mansion grew quiet, Evelyn gathered her things. Marcus trailed behind her, his chessbook tucked under his arm. As they walked toward the back door, Richard appeared in the hallway. His smile was tight, his voice laced with something Evelyn couldn't quite place. "Your boy's got a clever mind," he said slowly. "But don't let him get ideas above his place. Chess is just a game, Mrs. Carter. Best not to confuse it with real life." Evelyn swallowed her retort. She had learned long ago that men like Richard didn't want answers. They wanted obedience. She nodded politely, then ushered Marcus out into the night. In the car ride home, Marcus finally spoke. "Mama, he said, his voice calm but thoughtful. He didn't like losing. Evelyn sighed, her hands gripping the wheel. Men like him never do, baby. But what you did today. Her voice broke slightly, tears pricking her eyes. You made me proud. Don't you ever let anyone make you feel small? Marcus looked out the window, the city lights flashing across his face. I wasn't trying to make him feel small. I just wanted to play. And in that moment, Evelyn understood something important. Marcus wasn't just talented, he was pure in his love for the game. He didn't play to prove himself or to crush others, but because the board spoke to him in a way the world didn't. Word of the match spread faster than Evelyn expected. The guests who had witnessed the game couldn't resist retelling the story, though each version carried its own twist. Some painted Marcus as a prodigy, a boy genius who had humiliated a millionaire. Others spun it as a lucky fluke, dismissing him as a child who stumbled into victory. But no matter the version, Marcus's name was on their lips. At school, whispers began to circulate. Teachers noticed the sudden attention, classmates teased or stared, and Marcus found himself caught in a spotlight he never asked for. Some admired him, others resented him. Hey, chess boy, one student jeered in the cafeteria. Bet you think you're smarter than everybody now. Marcus ignored them, burying himself in his book. He had learned early on that the board was kinder than people. One afternoon, his math teacher, Mr. Daniels, pulled him aside. Marcus, I heard what you did at the Hale estate, he said, his tone half in awe, half in disbelief. Do you know what that means? Marcus shrugged. It means I won a game. Mr. Daniels chuckled. It means you have a gift. Have you ever thought about competing? There are tournaments, scholarships, opportunities. You could go far, son. The idea planted itself in Evelyn's mind like a seed. Opportunities, scholarships, a way out of the endless grind, the invisible life she had been forced to live. Maybe chess wasn't just Marcus's escape, it could be his future. But she also knew the dangers. The world didn't always celebrate black brilliance. Too often it tried to bury it, mock it, or claim it as its own. She feared what attention might bring, the envy, the prejudice, the attempts to diminish his light. Still, when she looked at Marcus, bent over the board with that quiet fire in his eyes, she knew she couldn't hold him back. Meanwhile, Richard Hale stewed in silence. The laughter of his colleagues echoed in his memory, every retelling of the story another cut to his pride. He began to see Marcus not as a child, but as a threat, a reminder that his power wasn't invincible. And Richard was not a man who tolerated threats. Weeks later, when Evelyn arrived for work, she noticed the change immediately. The glances were sharper, the tone colder. Tasks piled heavier than usual. Richard no longer smirked when he spoke to her, he scowled. He had been embarrassed in his own home, and someone had to pay. But Evelyn, resilient as ever, refused to bow. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity she always had. And Marcus at home continued to sharpen his mind, each game pushing him further toward a destiny neither of them had fully imagined. The match at the mansion had been the beginning, but it was not the end. It was the opening move in a much larger game, one that would test not just Marcus's genius, but their courage, their pride, and their will to rise above a world that wanted to keep them in the shadows. And as Marcus stared at the chessboard late into the night, replaying moves against invisible opponents, he whispered to himself the truth that would carry him forward. Every king can fall. The weeks that followed were restless ones. Marcus spent every spare moment hunched over his chessboard, replaying famous games from memory, scribbling notes in the margins of worn books borrowed from the library. His mind was a battlefield of rooks and pawns, his imagination filled with strategies that even seasoned players would struggle to follow. For Evelyn, life grew heavier. Richard's bitterness poisoned the air at the mansion. He gave her longer hours, harsher words, and assignments meant to humiliate her. She bore it with the quiet strength of a woman who had faced worse. But she knew what it truly was, punishment. Not for her mistakes, but for her son's brilliance. One evening, Marcus's math teacher, Mr. Daniels, arrived at their small apartment with an envelope in hand. He sat at their worn kitchen table and slid it across to Evelyn. There's a regional chess tournament next month, he explained. I pulled some strings to get Marcus registered. It's not just a game, it's a chance. If he wins, there are scholarships, sponsors. Doors could open for him. Evelyn hesitated, her fingers resting on the envelope. She thought of the long hours she worked to keep food on the table, the weight of bills, the uncertainty of their future. She thought of Richard Hale, whose pride still burned with anger. She thought of the risks of placing her son in a world that wasn't built to welcome him. But then she looked at Marcus, whose eyes lit up at the very mention of the word tournament. She nodded. He'll be there. The day of the tournament was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. The hall buzzed with anticipation. Rows of tables lined with boards, clocks ticking in the hands of nervous competitors. Most of the children were older, dressed in tailored clothes that marked their privileged backgrounds. Parents whispered from the sidelines, coaches murmured last-minute strategies. And then there was Marcus in a simple shirt, his only pair of polished shoes, holding his mother's hand. Some of the other families looked at him with curiosity, others with quiet disdain. One boy snickered openly. He doesn't look like a chess player, he whispered to a friend. But when the games began, appearances no longer mattered. Marcus moved like a storm, his mind several steps ahead of his opponents. He dismantled strategies with ease, countered attacks with precision, and turned each board into his own masterpiece. Whispered laughter gave way to stunned silence, then to murmurs of awe. One by one, his opponents fell, their kings cornered and toppled. By the final round, the room had gathered around his table. His opponent was the reigning champion, a boy 3 years older with trophies lined across his bedroom shelf. The match stretched on for nearly an hour, every move met with gasps from the crowd. Marcus played not with arrogance, but with calm certainty, as if the outcome was already written in the lines of the board. And then, with a soft but firm voice, he said the word that had silenced a millionaire weeks before. Checkmate. The hall erupted in applause. Evelyn clutched her chest, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of possibility, the sense that her son's brilliance could carry him far beyond the walls of kitchens and back doors. Marcus had not just won a game, he had claimed a place that no one could deny him. News of his victory spread quickly. Articles appeared in local papers. Young prodigy stuns at regional chess tournament. Photographs captured his shy smile, his mother's proud embrace. Invitations poured in for larger competitions, and whispers of scholarships became concrete offers. For the first time, Evelyn dared to believe that her son's future would not be defined by the struggles of her past. But not everyone celebrated. Richard Hale read the headlines with a scowl, his humiliation reignited. The boy who had embarrassed him in his own home was now being praised publicly. Each article felt like a direct attack on his pride. In his mind, Evelyn and Marcus had overstepped their place, and Richard Hale was determined to remind them of it. One afternoon, he called Evelyn into his office. He didn't offer her a seat. I read about your son, he said coldly. Seems he's made quite the name for himself. But let me remind you, Mrs. Carter, you work here. And the higher you try to climb, the harder the fall will be when people like me stop holding the ladder. Evelyn's heart pounded, but she stood tall. With respect, Mr. Hale, she replied, her voice steady. My son doesn't need your ladder. He's building his own. It was the first time she had spoken to him without fear, and Richard's glare darkened. He dismissed her with a sharp wave, but her words lingered like a wound he couldn't close. The months that followed proved Evelyn right. Marcus rose quickly through the ranks, competing in state tournaments, then national ones. Coaches marveled at his natural talent. Journalists called him a prodigy, and scholarship offers poured in. Each victory was not just his, it was Evelyn's too. It was proof that dignity, persistence, and belief could break through even the hardest ceilings. And though Richard continued his quiet hostility, he could do nothing to stop the tide. His wealth, his mansion, his pride, all of it paled against the brilliance of a boy who had turned their mockery into triumph. Years later, when Marcus stood on stage accepting a national championship trophy, the cameras flashing, the applause thunderous, Evelyn thought back to that fateful day in the mansion. The laughter, the sneers, the cruel joke, and she smiled through her tears. Knowing that moment had not broken them, it had birthed something greater. Her son was no longer just the maid's boy. He was a name the world knew, a genius who carried the hopes of every child who had ever been underestimated, every family who had been told to know their place. And as Marcus lifted his trophy high, his voice steady and strong, he said the words that captured it all. Genius doesn't belong to privilege. It belongs to those who refuse to stop learning no matter where they come from. The crowd roared. Evelyn's heart swelled. Richard Hale, watching from the shadows of a television screen miles away, felt the final, undeniable truth settle upon him. The joke had never been on the boy. The joke had always been on him.